"I'm sorry, Harold, but you're not getting a dime." The words landed hard. Harder than I expected, even though part of me had been bracing for something like this since the moment Carolyn called and asked me to come. I was still holding the folder, my father's trust documents, printed and bound the way he always kept important papers, when my stepbrother Daniel reached over and slid it right out of my hands. Slowly, deliberately, like taking something from me was the easiest thing in the world. Carolyn didn't even glance in my direction. She lifted her wine glass and took a long sip, like this was just another quiet evening in her glass-walled living room. "You were never really part of this family," she added. My chest tightened so hard I thought something might crack inside me. 40 years. 40 years of showing up. Every holiday, every birthday, every hospital visit, every funeral. Every hard season my father walked through, I walked through beside him. And she reduced all of it to nothing in one sentence without even putting down her glass. Then Daniel smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile. It wasn't even a mean one. It was satisfied. Patient. Like a man who had been waiting a long time for a specific moment and had finally arrived at it. That smile told me everything I needed to know. This was not a misunderstanding. This had been planned. My name is Harold Whitaker. I am 58 years old, and for most of those years, I believed that if you worked hard and stayed loyal to the people you loved, life would eventually be fair to you. Standing in that living room, I understood for the first time how wrong I had been. My father, Walter Whitaker, spent his life building something real from almost nothing. A modest construction business that he grew carefully over 3 decades into a portfolio of properties and investments. He was not a flashy man. He did not spend money to impress people. He saved, he planned, and when he knew his health was failing, he set up a trust to make sure I would be taken care of in retirement. Not a fortune. Just security. The kind of thing a father builds when he loves his child and wants to protect them even after he is gone. He remarried 12 years ago. Carolyn came with 2 adult children, Daniel and his younger sister, Nadia. I kept my distance but stayed respectful. My father seemed genuinely happy with her, and that mattered more to me than my own discomfort. When he passed away 2 years ago, I gave myself time to grieve before approaching the estate. That patience, I now realized, was the first mistake I had made. I looked across the table at Daniel and asked him quietly, "How did you pull this off?" He leaned back in his chair like the question was a gift. "That's the thing, Harold," Daniel said. "We didn't pull anything. Dad changed it himself." His tone was relaxed. Almost bored. Like explaining something obvious to someone slow. They showed me the updated trust documents. My father's signature was right there on the final page, neat and notarized, dated 11 months before he passed. But something about it did not sit right with me. I had watched my father sign his name my entire life. Birthday cards when I was a child. Business contracts at the kitchen table. Letters he wrote by hand because he never fully trusted computers. His signature had a very specific quality to it, a deep loop on the capital W, and a way of trailing off at the end that was entirely his own. What I was looking at had the right general shape, the right letters. But the pressure of the strokes was slightly different. The way the letters connected was not quite how I remembered. Not wrong enough to stand in a courtroom and shout forgery. Just different enough to plant something cold and persistent in the back of my mind. I pointed it out calmly. Carefully. Carolyn laughed. "You're not a handwriting expert, Harold." She was right about that. I wasn't. But I was my father's son. I had watched him sign his name hundreds of times across my entire life. I knew that signature the way you know someone's face. And this one was not completely his. I left without raising my voice. I think that unsettled them more than anything else I could have done. Daniel had positioned himself near the hallway like he was ready to manage a scene. Carolyn had set her wine glass down and straightened slightly in her chair. Both of them were braced for anger. For shouting, pleading, maybe something louder. Instead, I picked up my jacket from the arm of the chair where I had set it when I arrived, nodded once at no one in particular, and walked toward the front door. The house was impressive in the way that expensive houses built to impress people always are. Marble floors that turned every footstep into an echo. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. My father's art collection covering every wall, paintings and prints he had collected over 30 years, now hanging in rooms that had nothing to do with him anymore. Daniel called after me when I reached the hallway. "Don't bother coming back, Harold." I didn't turn around, but I did smile. Just slightly. Just to myself. A quiet, private smile that no one else could see. Because something had shifted inside me in the space of that single afternoon. The grief was still there, sitting heavily in my chest where it had lived since my father died. The anger was there too. But underneath both of those things, something else was beginning to form. Something I did not yet have a full name for. I walked out to my car and sat in it for a long time without starting the engine. I sat in that car for almost an hour. The engine was off. The street outside the house was quiet and still. A few birds moved through the trees along the fence line, unbothered and completely unaware that something important had just happened inside that glass-walled room. I kept turning one name over in my mind. Not Daniel's name. Not Carolyn's. Arthur Pennick. He was my father's original estate attorney. A careful, methodical man who had handled our family's legal affairs for nearly 20 years. He had helped my father build the trust structure from the beginning, and he understood it better than anyone alive. Daniel had made a point of replacing Arthur immediately after the funeral. He brought in a new firm, one connected to Carolyn's side of things, before the estate had even been formally opened. At the time, I had not thought much of it. Families changed attorneys. It happened. Now it felt deliberate. I found Arthur's number buried in my contacts, left over from a message my father had forwarded me years earlier. I stared at it for a long time. Part of me was afraid of what I might hear. Part of me was not sure I was ready to start walking down a road I could not come back from. Then I thought about Daniel's smile. I pressed call. The phone rang 3 times. Then Arthur answered, and there was a pause before he said a single word. "Harold." His voice was quiet and careful. "I was wondering when you'd call." My stomach dropped. That pause told me more than any sentence could have. We agreed to meet the following morning. A small coffee shop on the far side of the city, nowhere near any office either of us was connected to. Arthur arrived before I did. He was already seated in a corner booth with a cup of black coffee and a worn leather briefcase on the seat beside him. He looked older than I remembered. Quieter. But his eyes were clear and sharp. He did not waste any time. "Your father updated the trust, yes," Arthur said, folding his hands carefully on the table. "But not in the way they're claiming." He explained it slowly and precisely. When Carolyn's legal team moved in after the funeral, they located and filed a version of the trust update. The paperwork was technically real, in the sense that documents existed and had been processed. But there was a problem. They had not requested everything. There were additional documents. Supplementary clauses my father had added quietly during his final months, after a long conversation he had with Arthur about the people who would be left behind when he was gone. Documents that Daniel and Carolyn's attorneys had either missed entirely or deliberately set aside. Documents tied directly to the one asset Daniel had fought the hardest to keep. Arthur reached into his briefcase and set a sealed manila envelope on the table between us. "It's about the island," he said. I almost smiled when Arthur said that word. The island. A small private island off the coast, purchased by my father years earlier as a long-term investment. He had always been honest about the fact that it was expensive to maintain and complicated to manage properly. In the final year before he passed, he had actually suggested selling it. He had said, more than once, that it was more trouble than it was worth and that whoever inherited it would quickly discover why he felt that way. Daniel had refused to hear any of it. He insisted on keeping the island from the very first meeting after the funeral, loudly and repeatedly, with the kind of certainty that only comes from someone who has never once had to sit down and manage a complex financial liability. To Daniel, the island was not an investment. It was a crown. Something to mention at dinner parties. Something to photograph and post online. Something that made him feel like a certain kind of person. Arthur opened the envelope and spread the contents across the table between us. The island had been transferred to Daniel and Nadia as direct inheritors, removed from the broader trust structure at their own insistence. But buried inside the legal framework my father had quietly constructed around that transfer was a clause none of them had fully read. Full ownership meant full financial liability. No trust protections. No shared responsibility. Every cost, maintenance, staffing, and the outstanding operating loan tied to the property fell entirely on whoever held the title. And attached to that loan was one specific trigger clause. One missed payment. That was all it would take to set everything in motion. I drove home slowly that evening, turning everything Arthur had explained over carefully in my mind. My father had known. He had seen clearly who these people were, probably long before any of us gave him credit for, and in his quiet, methodical way, he had built something into the structure of the estate that protected me. Not loudly. Not in a way that would have flagged to anyone reviewing the documents carelessly. But it was there, solid and patient, waiting for the right set of conditions to activate. I sat in my kitchen that night thinking about him planning all of this. Sitting across from Arthur in that office, working through every possible scenario, building in protections for a son he knew would not see the danger coming until it was almost too late. It made me miss him in a way that was almost impossible to sit with. About 2 months after my meeting with Arthur, I received a call from a former property manager who had worked briefly on the island's operations team before resigning. He told me things were not going smoothly. Maintenance costs had turned out to be significantly higher than Daniel had anticipated. A serious storm the previous season had damaged 2 of the dock structures and caused major roof damage to the main guest house. Staffing had become a constant problem. Several key people had quietly left and not been replaced. Daniel had begun selling off smaller estate assets to cover the gaps. But the island itself? He was holding on to it with both hands. That crown was not going anywhere. Not yet. The hardest thing I have ever done in my life is nothing. Not the passive kind of nothing, where time passes and things are left unresolved. The active, deliberate kind. The kind where every single instinct you have is pushing you to move, to confront, to say something, and you have to take all of that pressure and hold it completely still inside yourself. Every week brought a new piece of information. Arthur kept me updated through careful, quiet channels. My property manager contact passed along news when he had it. The picture that was forming across those months was one of a family burning through resources faster than they could replace them, held in place by nothing but pride and the stubborn refusal to admit they had reached too far. There were moments when I wanted to call Daniel directly. Not to fight. Just to tell him what I already knew. Just to watch the certainty drop from his voice. I didn't. Because moving too early would have ruined everything. The trigger clause in the island's loan structure was precise, and if I acted before conditions were exactly right, I risked alerting their attorneys to the pathway Arthur had identified. They would have found a way to patch it. Refinanced. Restructured. I needed them to believe they were still in complete control of the situation. So I waited. And every single day that I waited, the island cost them more than the day before. The costs did not pause. They did not rest. They just accumulated quietly and steadily, the way all neglected things do. For months after my first meeting with Arthur, it happened. A missed payment. The island's operating loan required a structured monthly payment to the lending institution that held the mortgage on the property's infrastructure. The amount was not small, but it was manageable for someone who was handling their finances responsibly. It was the kind of payment a person with proper financial planning could meet without significant stress. Daniel was not handling his finances responsibly. Arthur received word through professional channels that the scheduled payment had not been processed on its due date. The loan agreement included a standard 5-day grace period, followed by a secondary grace period of 10 business days with penalty fees added. Daniel missed both windows. By the time the lending institution issued its first formal notice, the account was nearly 3 weeks past due. In most situations, a single missed payment is recoverable. Banks understand that circumstances change. People make arrangements. Loans get restructured. Under normal conditions, Daniel could have made a call, offered a partial payment, explained the situation, and bought himself some breathing room. But the trigger clause in my father's original documentation was not concerned with the missed payment itself. It was about what that missed payment activated. A mandatory review of all ownership documentation tied to the property. A review that required outside parties to be formally included in the process. The door had cracked open. All I had to do was step through it at exactly the right moment. The bank assigned a review officer to the island's loan file within days of the formal notice going out. His name was Mr. Clifford, and from everything Arthur could find out about him, he was thorough, experienced, and entirely uninterested in family drama or personal feelings about the situation. That is the thing about banks. They do not care about history. They do not care that Daniel had insisted on keeping the island because it made him feel significant. They do not care that Carolyn had hosted expensive weekend gatherings there while the estate was slowly running dry. They care about numbers, risk, and whether the asset backing a loan is being responsibly maintained or quietly falling apart. The island was falling apart. Mr. Clifford's review uncovered maintenance backlogs that had been pushed back for over a year. The storm damage from the previous season, the dock structures and guest house roof, had still not been properly repaired. Only temporary patches had been applied. 2 environmental compliance filings had been submitted past their deadlines, resulting in fines that were sitting unpaid on the property account. The preliminary assessment from the review was not generous toward Daniel. He managed to get a call scheduled with a senior representative at the bank, trying to negotiate. Arthur found out later that the call lasted less than 20 minutes. Apparently, Daniel had not fully understood the terms of the loan he had inherited. He was beginning to understand them now. While Daniel scrambled to manage the bank's review, Arthur had been quietly examining something else. Buried deep inside the original loan documentation, the kind of clause that gets included as standard legal language by a bank's legal team and rarely receives much attention, was a provision Arthur had first noticed during our initial meetings. It stated that in the event of a sustained payment default, combined with a formal determination of asset deterioration, the lending institution had the right to facilitate a structured sale of the property to a qualified external buyer. Not a chaotic forced auction. A clean, professionally managed transfer of ownership through a formal acquisition process. The bank would recover the full outstanding balance. The current owners would receive whatever equity remained after all debts were settled. The buyer would receive the property with a clean title and no lingering legal complications. The process was designed to be efficient and legally airtight. Arthur brought in a property acquisition specialist, a careful, experienced woman named Patricia Hollis, to review every document in the file. She went through everything twice and confirmed that the pathway was completely solid. No loopholes. No tricks. No gray areas. Every step was legal, documented, and fully defensible under Washington state property law. All that was needed was a qualified buyer. Someone with the financial standing, the proper legal representation, and the patience to have waited for exactly this moment. Arthur looked at me across the conference table when he finished explaining all of it. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. I stared at the paperwork Patricia had laid out in front of me for a long time. It was a quiet evening. The conference room window looked out over the city lights below, and I sat there in the stillness reading through every page carefully. Not because I didn't understand what I was looking at, but because I needed to be completely certain, completely honest with myself, about what I was doing and the reasons I was doing it. I want to be clear about something. Anger was not driving this. Anger had come in waves over the months since that afternoon in Carolyn's living room. I had felt it late at night when I could not sleep. I had felt it in the early mornings when I first woke up, and the whole situation settled back onto my chest before I had a chance to prepare for it. But anger is loud and impulsive and makes poor decisions. What I was holding in my hands required the exact opposite of that. What was driving me was something colder and steadier. A clear-eyed decision made with full awareness of every possible consequence. I thought about my father, sitting across from Arthur in this same building during his final months, quietly building something into those documents to protect the son he knew he would be leaving behind. I picked up the pen. I signed the buyer authorization form that Patricia had prepared. The process had officially begun. The formal acquisition offer was submitted through the bank's structured process exactly as Patricia and Arthur had set it up. It came from a registered holding company, properly filed, professionally presented, accompanied by full proof of financial standing. My name appeared on none of the surface documents. To anyone reviewing the offer from the outside, It looked like a straightforward approach from an experienced outside investor looking to acquire a distressed coastal property at its current assessed value. Daniel rejected the offer within 48 hours. I had expected that. Arthur had predicted it too. Daniel was not going to give up his crown to a faceless holding company without a fight. Even with the bank's review process actively running and maintenance bills continuing to pile up on his desk, he still believed he was the one controlling this situation. His pride would not allow him to see it any other way. He had his attorneys send back a counter-response that Patricia later described, with rare dry humor, as almost impressive in its detachment from reality. The figure Daniel proposed in return was nearly double the property's current assessed value, a value that had already dropped significantly because of the deterioration issues the bank's own review had documented. The holding company's representatives noted his counter-response politely. Then they withdrew. The offer was formally off the table. Now it was simply a matter of letting pressure do what pressure does when nothing relieves it. It did not take long. The weeks that followed were genuinely difficult to watch, even from where I was standing. I want to be honest about that. Whatever Daniel and Carolyn had done to me, there was nothing satisfying about watching people lose options one by one. It was just necessary. The island continued to deteriorate. Without steady investment and proper care, coastal properties decline faster than most people expect. Salt air attacks structures relentlessly. Equipment breaks down without maintenance. The main guest house, which had been the centerpiece of Daniel's carefully photographed weekend gatherings, was now flagged in the bank's updated property assessment as uninhabitable without major renovation. A seasonal rental arrangement that Daniel had quietly set up to generate income and help offset operating costs collapsed when a property inspection uncovered the structural issues. Existing bookings were canceled. Deposits had to be returned. 3 more staff members resigned and were not replaced. Daniel sold 2 more assets from the estate to keep the loan payments technically current, but only barely. He was running out of sellable things. The holding company's offer, the one he had dismissed so confidently just weeks earlier, no longer seemed quite so insulting when he thought about it quietly in the evenings. I knew this because his attorneys reached out to the acquisition team. Not an acceptance. Not yet. But a carefully worded question delivered through professional channels. Was the original offer still available for discussion? They did not come to me directly. That would have required more honesty than either Daniel or Carolyn had ever managed in the time I had known them. Instead, they worked through intermediaries. Careful, vague communications passed through their attorneys to Patricia's team, testing for any flexibility in the original terms. Could the acquisition timeline be extended? Could certain conditions be adjusted? Could a slightly revised offer be considered? Patricia handled every response with the same composed, professional tone she brought to everything. She was patient. She was polite. And she did not move on the core terms. The offer was what it had always been. The bank's timeline was fixed. The assessed value of the property was based on documented evidence and was not going to change based on what the current owners preferred it to be worth. I sat in on one of the phone calls between the legal teams. I did not speak. I just listened. You could hear the pressure underneath the formal legal language on Daniel's side. The way certain questions came back a second time, slightly rephrased. The way silences stretched just a beat too long after Patricia gave a direct answer. The way their lead attorney kept steering the conversation toward hypothetical arrangements that were really just different versions of the same underlying question. Is there any version of this where we come out of it better than we currently expect? There wasn't. And somewhere in the middle of all those careful words and long pauses, I think Daniel already knew the answer. The bank's formal default notice arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Arthur called me within the hour, not to celebrate, but simply to inform me in the same steady, careful tone he used for everything. The lending institution had completed its full review, assessed the outstanding obligations against the current documented value of the asset, and formally determined that the loan was in a state of unrecoverable default. A structured sale process was now officially initiated. Daniel's attorneys filed 2 separate objections within the first 24 hours. Both were reviewed by the bank's legal team and denied. The objections were technical arguments about notification procedures and process timelines, The kind of last-ditch legal moves that signal a team that has exhausted all real options and is now simply trying to slow things down long enough to find an exit that doesn't exist. The process did not slow. Patricia confirmed that the holding company's acquisition offer, formally resubmitted through the bank at the original terms, had been accepted by the institution as the basis for the structured sale. There was one final door still open for Daniel. If he could raise the full outstanding loan balance within 30 days and settle all outstanding fees and penalties in one payment, the sale process would be paused. He would have needed a sum he absolutely did not have. His attorneys knew it. The bank knew it. Arthur and I knew it. Daniel came to the table. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone mostly cold while I reviewed some unrelated paperwork. When my phone rang and I saw the number, I went completely still. It was Carolyn's number. It had been nearly 10 months since I walked out of that glass-walled living room. 10 months of patience, silence, and careful, deliberate work. And now her name was on my screen on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I let it ring twice. Not because I needed time to decide whether to answer, but because I wanted to experience the moment clearly. Not with bitterness. Not with triumph. Just honestly, for exactly what it was. I answered on the third ring. Carolyn's voice was different from the last time I had heard it. Every trace of the flat, practiced certainty she had worn at that meeting was gone. What replaced it was smaller and quieter, the voice of someone who has run completely out of moves and knows it with their whole body. "Harold," she said, "we need to talk." 3 words. The same 3 words that could have started an honest conversation 2 years ago, right after my father's funeral, before any of this had happened. Before the frozen trust fund, before the documents I was not allowed to hold, before Daniel's satisfied smile across the table. I kept my voice calm. "All right," I said. "Where and when?" There was a brief pause on the other end. "Here," she said. "Whenever you're willing to come." I drove back to that house 3 days later. The same road through the same neighborhood. The same gate at the end of the long driveway. The same view of the water through the pine trees as I pulled up and parked. But everything felt completely different from the last time. When I had arrived the first time, I had been holding my father's trust documents and carrying a small, quiet hope that maybe there had been some misunderstanding. That maybe there was a reasonable explanation I hadn't yet heard. That maybe the people inside that house were not exactly who I feared they were. This time I arrived with Arthur beside me and a full briefcase of documentation that told a complete and clear story from beginning to end. Carolyn met us at the door. She looked tired in a way that went beyond a difficult week. The polished composure she had worn at our last meeting was simply gone. She led us through the same marble-floored hallway to the same living room, the same glass walls, the same view of the water, the same artwork on the walls that my father had spent 30 years collecting. Daniel was already seated when we walked in. He didn't stand up, but he didn't smile either. His sister Nadia sat across the room from him, arms folded tightly, staring at the floor. She had barely been present during my first visit, staying somewhere in the background. Now she looked like someone waiting for a result she already knew was not going in her favor. I sat down across from Daniel and opened my briefcase. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after I placed the first set of documents on the table. Daniel looked at them without reaching for them. His eyes moved slowly across the top page, and his expression was something I had never seen on his face in all the years I had known him. Not arrogance. Not amusement. Something more uncertain than either of those things. After a long moment, he looked up at me. "You knew this would happen," he said. It came out somewhere between a statement and a question. I didn't look away from him. "I knew what was in the documents your lawyers didn't read," I said. "Your father made sure of that." The phrase "your father" sat in the air between us like something physical. I had chosen those words deliberately. Not to wound him, but to be precise. Because Walter Whitaker had been my father. A man who had spent years watching the people his wife brought into his life, and who had spent his final months making quiet, careful arrangements to ensure that his real son would not be left with nothing. Daniel's jaw tightened. Carolyn was looking at a fixed point somewhere between the table and the window, like a person trying to remember how a long sequence of events had led her to exactly this chair. Nadia had not moved. "You should have read everything he left you," I said simply. The silence that settled over the room after that was the heaviest thing in it. What came next was something I had not fully anticipated, even after everything. They asked for help. Not with conditions attached. Not with negotiations hidden behind the request. Not with the veiled threats that had characterized every communication from their side over the past several months. They just asked. Daniel leaned forward with his elbows on the table and his hands clasped together and said, in a voice I had genuinely never heard from him before, "Is there anything you can do?" It was the voice of a man who had run completely out of road and was staring at the one person he had always assumed would never hold any power in this situation. Carolyn spoke after him. She said they had not fully understood the liability that came with the island when they had fought so hard to keep it. That the attorneys they had brought in after the funeral had missed critical details. That the past year had been much harder than anyone on the outside could see. I listened to everything without interrupting. I had spent 10 months staying patient and quiet while they did whatever they wanted with my father's estate. I could manage a little more patience now. Nadia finally lifted her eyes from the floor and looked at me directly. She did not say anything out loud. But her expression held the same question the other two were asking in their own different ways. Was there any way through this that did not end in complete loss? I looked at all three of them and said I had something prepared. I had thought carefully about this moment for weeks before it arrived. Not about making the terms cruel. Not about building in punishment for the sake of it. I had thought about what was fair, what was clean, and what would close this chapter completely without leaving any opening for future disputes or complications. Arthur had helped me structure everything in advance. It was simple on purpose. The holding company would proceed with the acquisition of the island through the bank's formal process. The outstanding loan would be settled in full. The property would transfer with a completely clean title. In exchange, Daniel and Nadia would sign a full and permanent release of any remaining claims against my father's original trust structure. Every account and asset that had been wrongly frozen or redirected would be formally reviewed by an independent third-party auditor, with any amounts owed to me clearly identified and returned in full. Carolyn would have no further involvement in any estate matter going forward. No criminal complaints. No civil suits over the signature irregularities Arthur and I had documented. No public proceedings of any kind. A clean exit for everyone involved. I slid the written terms across the table. "Read every page," I said. "Every clause. Every line." I looked at Daniel when I said it. I held his gaze long enough to make sure he understood exactly what I meant. "Take whatever time you need. But read it all." They took 3 full days. I had expected that, and I was glad for it. Arthur had advised me from the beginning to give them proper time to review everything with their own counsel, and I agreed completely. The last thing I wanted after all of this was for any party to sign something they later claimed not to have understood. I wanted no ambiguity. No reversals. No gaps for anyone to crawl through later. Their attorneys came back with 2 requests for minor clarification on the independent audit process, and 1 question about the specific timeline for the trust fund review. Arthur handled all 3 responses promptly and with complete transparency. On the 4th morning, a courier arrived at Arthur's office with the signed documents. Arthur called me immediately. I was already on my way over. I arrived to find him sitting at his desk with the package open, going through each page methodically, checking every signature line, every initials box, every notary stamp. When he reached the final page, he set the documents down flat on the desk and looked at me over his reading glasses. "That's everything," he said simply. I nodded. I had expected to feel something large in that moment. Relief, or victory, or release. But what I actually felt was quieter than any of those things. It was the steady, settling sense of something completing properly. Like a lock clicking shut at the end of a very long hallway. Everything my father had built for me was coming back where it belonged. The ownership transfer closed on a Thursday morning in late spring. I was sitting in Arthur's office when Patricia called to confirm that all documentation had been fully processed by the bank and that the title had transferred cleanly. The island was no longer an asset tied to Daniel and Nadia. The outstanding loan was settled. The acquisition was legally complete in every respect. Arthur offered his quiet congratulations. Patricia said the final closing paperwork would be sent over by end of day. It was a brief, professional call. Calm and clear, the way all of it had been handled from the very beginning. Daniel found out who the buyer actually was sometime later that same afternoon. I don't know exactly how the information reached him. Perhaps the holding company's registered documents contained enough detail for his attorneys to trace a connection. Perhaps someone in the process recognized something. It didn't matter. What mattered was the message he sent me that evening. 3 words. You planned this. I read it twice, standing at my kitchen counter with my phone in my hand. Then I set the phone down and stood there for a moment, looking out the window at the last of the afternoon light moving across the yard. He was right. I had planned it. But what he still did not fully understand, what I suspected he might never completely understand, was that I had not planned it from a place of obsession or cruelty. I had simply done what my father had quietly made possible. I had read everything. I flew out to the island 6 weeks after the transfer closed. The first morning there, I walked the full length of the main dock while the sun was still coming up over the water. The dock needed significant repair work, more than the photographs had suggested, and the guest house would require a full renovation before it was usable again. But the land itself was solid. The water around it was clear and perfectly still in the early light, and the air carried that particular combination of salt and pine that belongs only to places right at the edge of the sea. I stood at the far end of the dock for a long time without doing anything at all. My father had stood in this exact spot. I had a photograph of him here, taken years before his health began to decline. He is looking out at the water with his hands in his jacket pockets, and there is something completely relaxed in his posture. Something that says a man who has worked hard for a long time and is finally standing somewhere that means something real to him. I had that photograph in my jacket pocket when I stood there that morning. Daniel never sent another message after those 3 words. I never replied. Some things do not require a response. Some lessons only land properly when they arrive through consequences, not through conversation. My father used to say that patient, honest living was the only real protection a man had in this world. He was right about that. He built me a pathway through the worst of this, and all I had to do was find it, trust it, and follow it all the way through without rushing. I did. And standing there on that dock, in the clean quiet of the early morning with the water moving gently below me and the sun coming up over the horizon, I finally felt completely like myself again.